Welcome to part 6, the sixth program in our series looking at the story in Genesis. I'm going to try and pull together the evidence coming from the sciences and history and other sources with the evidence from the biblical text of Genesis, aiming for a unified understanding. First of all, let's look at some quotations. This great project, when it announced the outcomes, when it had cracked it, one of the speakers said that. Today we are learning the language in which God created life. We're gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, and the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. At a great medical biological conference, that's who said it. That was also said by another speaker. It's a happy day for the world. It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we've caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God. Professor Collins was at that time the director of the whole project and a totally committed follower of Jesus. They didn't see the problems between biology and Genesis. Long ago, the great philosopher said this: two things fill me with constantly increasing admiration and awe: the starry heavens without and the moral law within. The fact that there's a sense of right and wrong within all human beings. And the greatest physicist of the 20th century: science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And back to Professor Collins: science is not threatened by God, it is enhanced. God is most certainly not threatened by science. He made it all possible. And then the book of Proverbs. It's not good to have zeal without knowledge. There's a lot of enthusiasm in many writings, but sometimes the knowledge of the authors is a bit woeful. Augustine draws that out and makes the same point all these centuries ago. He said he was saddened by Christians who showed a complete disregard for things well supported by evidence, thus bringing the entire truth of the gospel into disrepute. His actual words, all right, translation old. He speaks about talking nonsense on these topics. And he speaks about outsiders laughing it to scorn. In the world in which I move, I hear much laughing to scorn some of the Christian writings that are going on at the moment. Let's try and bring it together. Let's try and fulfill the desire of Augustine. Let's see science and religion as complementary in their insights, because that's what science does. And that's what religion does. And when religion tries to answer scientific questions, it's in trouble. And when science starts to answer religious questions, it's in trouble. They're complementary. Augustine would like that. Science has its laws. They're just summaries of principles that always seem to apply, if you like, hypotheses that are very well supported. That indicates the direction of all change. That changed the complete thinking of the world with regard to space, time, and distance. And the law of gravity? A hypothesis? I wouldn't like to defy it. I'm going to suggest maybe there are spiritual laws. Here's a couple. They're exactly the same. Kant's moral law. Within all human beings, there is something of a sense of right and wrong. Far from perfect, but it's there. Complicated word, but it's simply that within all human beings, we have a sense, an awareness of that which is beyond us, if you like the spiritual. Spiritual laws, scientific laws. Those who come from an atheist perspective have tried to use the findings of science to destroy religion. Only a few in number, but they're very vocal today. You've probably heard this. What evolution does is it removes the need for special creation because it describes the mechanism that God has used. But it doesn't prove or disprove God or how he did things. Some say that. They believe that people, religious people, perhaps Christian people, are stupid, irrational, or maybe best misled. Now, you can't prove God by argument, but there are strong logical grounds. There's a sound intellectual basis for all that's in the Bible and the whole basis of the Christian faith. Let's restore that, and let's announce it and make it open. There are those who say that. Tragically, the first part is true. Still happening today. In the name of religion, people are blowing themselves and other people up. But in the West, we did some terrible things several hundred years ago. But the second part doesn't follow because they forget that great good has also been done. Just look at history. Look at all the developments. How many of them have come out from people with a Christian perspective doing it because they've got a Christian perspective. You'll meet these things. People will use science to try and demolish religion, but it's only because they've already made up their mind that they're anti-religious. Thinking has changed over the centuries. For a long time, revelation was the source of evidence. And then the Reformation brought a change, and the Enlightenment followed it, and reason started to become important. People used the design and complexity of the universe as an argument for God, rather than taking the biblical text and saying, well, it's there, that's revelation. I think we were wrong. And Darwin did us a great favour by destroying that design argument. He showed it didn't constitute any argument for the existence of God or against the existence of God. He separated it out. Let's look at today. I'm going to give you 4 pictures here. They're not the only 4. In creationism, faith trumps reason. I believe, and therefore I will disregard all the evidence from other sources. Now, it's a misunderstanding of the word faith in the Hebrew and the Greek. But that's the argument. Atheism does it the other way around. I have worked it out. There's no room for believing anything. Intelligent design, which is very recent, thinks that science needs God's help. We'll come back to these in a moment. I'm going to argue for that. Harmony. Science and the biblical text answer different questions, and they're in harmony. That is my argument, and I'm going to try and show it. That's the aim. The word is harmony, but so often it's not there. And most of the disharmony, sad to say, has been caused by Christians. Creationism and intelligent design. Disharmony. They have brought disharmony between the biblical text and the evidence from the sciences and history, anthropology, and have just said these things are wrong. What I'd like to do is to bring back the harmony. Get rid of the disharmony and restore the harmony. Come with me. Use your mind. Use your knowledge. Use your thought processes to weigh what I'm going to reveal and present. I'm going to give you a quick overall picture of creationism. This is a recent thing. We'll show later that it didn't occur in most of the history of the Christian faith. The idea of the age of the earth being that, or anything like that, simply cannot be true. The evidence from numerous sources is consistent. That's not true. That contradicts the evidence completely. Adam and Eve created in a literal sense, highly unlikely. Many accept microevolution but reject macroevolution. Macro means one species evolving to another one. But biology research has shown that there's no real distinction, there's an overlap. They dismiss evolution as a theory. It's just a theory. They don't understand the word theory. Gravity is just a theory. Would you contradict gravity? Many of the supposed gaps are steadily being filled in. That's simply impossible. And the intermediate forms, they're slowly being found. Most things don't fossilize, and it takes a lot of research and finding for these to come up. That's simply not true. The second law of thermodynamics has never been found to be contradicted. And it's certainly not contradicted by evolution. It's because the people don't understand the law of a system and its surroundings. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And genetic evidence contradicts that view. Now that's creationism, but it produces enormous numbers of contradictions, not just with one or two things, not just to one or two people, but contradictions all over the place. And scientists just can't cope with that. These contradictions are too well founded. They can't be thrown out just like that. You see, that interpretation is modern. It started to evolve in the Protestant era, beginning to make progress in the 19th century, but it didn't really come into its full flood till 1960. And if you're going to be a literalist about Genesis 1 and 2, you've got to be a literalist about the whole Bible, and that has problems. Some would argue that all the fossils were put there by God to test our faith. And then God is generating a great cosmic hoax. That's not the God of the Bible. Contradicts the picture of the God in the Bible. But creationism is doing immense damage to the way of Jesus, because it's making a fool of it in the eyes of thinking people throughout the world. Now many, I don't know if it's most or many or some, have moved to intelligent design. So let's move to this next perspective. It isn't quite the same as that, but there is a lot of overlap. Now, it started to develop in the 1990s, and it has three basic tenets. It believes that evolution promotes an atheistic worldview, therefore we must resist it at all costs. Well, the first statement is not true. Atheists will be atheists whatever comes up. Evolution doesn't promote any worldview, atheist or otherwise. They believe it doesn't account for the complexity of nature. The evidence from biology and other sources shows that it does account. Therefore they argue there must be a designer. Now you see, it doesn't argue that there's a designer. Evolution is a mechanism. The mechanism could be done by a designer. Intelligent design claims to be scientific. Now, creationism doesn't, but intelligent design strongly does. But there are no research papers in refereed journals. There's no research evidence presented. It's untestable what they are proposing. There's no challenge and debate in scientific meetings based on evidence. It's just speculation. Now, we're entitled to speculate. We're entitled, all of us, to hold our opinions. But we've got to look at the evidence. And there are certain ways that things are done in the scientific world that have evolved in the scientific world that are so important. The problem with intelligent design is it isn't supported either theologically, because it suggests that God had to intervene to correct for the inadequacies of the evolutionary process, but he created them. So there's a contradiction in terms there. And it's not supported scientifically, because it's confused that. Of course there are things that we don't know, but you can't assume that because we don't know them now, they're unknowable. And the real danger with intelligent design is it's going to generate what's known as a God of the gaps. God is being brought in to explain things that we don't know and don't understand. Now that's happened over the centuries and it's an immense damage. But we don't need to go down that line. It's a cul-de-sac. Pointers to God's existence? Yes, the evidence is strong. The evidence is crystal clear. And it is quite amazing the balance of extreme improbabilities that allow life to exist on this planet. That certainly points to God's existence, but doesn't prove it. Then there is within the human being what C.S. Lewis developed from Kant, this awareness of right and wrong. Does that point to a creator who's morally perfect, who cares about people, wishes to relate personally to people? Doesn't prove it, but these are pointers, positive pointers, encouraging pointers, pointing to the power in the mind of God, pointing to the nature of God. They don't prove it, but they point to it. That's so important. There is no proof of anything in this world today, and science never proves. Pointers, evidence. Let's go down that line. I'm trying to look for a better way forward, a way to bring things together. Here's things about which there is no disagreement. This remarkable situation of our planet's survival to make life possible. Now, we don't know exactly how the first life occurred, but there's a lot of evidence suggestive about it. But once it started, evolution and natural selection kick in, and they determine the development over enormously long periods of time. Divine intervention is not needed. God used this as the mechanism. He set it in motion. We're part of this. The evidence is very strong. But there are ways in which we human beings, we go beyond the evolutionary explanation. Where is this spiritual basis that we possess? How did that get there in evolutionary terms? Now we're in the business of where Genesis really gives us a clear answer. How do we know about right and wrong? And the search for God that characterizes all cultures. Now these are things about which there is just common agreement. The evidence is very, very strong. We know it started a long time ago. We know about the mechanisms of evolution. They're inbuilt. Darwin did his observations brilliantly, and it led to a model. It wasn't until genetics came up that we knew why his model was right, because it gave us the mechanisms. We know that humans, as we understand humans today, arose about then in East Africa. We know that the humanity that is us arose from about 10,000 individuals. God set all that in place. The evidence is strong and it doesn't contradict Genesis. God is behind it all. That's what Genesis is making clear. Science can't show that. It can show the mechanisms. What about Adam? Now, we noted before that the word in the Hebrew can just mean collective humanity. A man, humanity, human being, the human species, Adam. Translators have put it with a capital letter at certain points and have done it with great skill and sensitivity. But it's their opinion, their judgment. Was it a specific person? Now, people have said you can go to Paul's writings, and Paul said there was. Not so. You can interpret Paul's insights either way. What Genesis does point to is that at some point, with someone or someones, either if you take Adam as humanity or Adam as an individual, there's a spiritual enabling. God breathed his spirit into humanity. He made us spiritually aware. Genesis speaks of humanity made in the image and likeness of God. We do what God does. We are what God is. Because he made us that way. That's beyond the evolution. We have a spiritual capacity. We know from the scientific evidence that this happened, although it wasn't large numbers. And we do know that the earliest communities arose in the Middle East just after the Ice Age. But where do Adam and Eve fit in all of this? What about Eden? Remember, the word Eden is just a Hebrew word. We put a capital letter on it. Much of the story appears symbolic. That isn't suggesting for a moment it's not true. It's a garden paradise. Its description fits Mesopotamia. The significance of the story is so important. God made the world a paradise for mankind, but we messed it up. And there are consequences for that mess. That's what the writer to Genesis is revealing to us. That is what's so important. Bring them together. Two ways of interpreting this. Or if we take the line that Adam is just man, now both of these are possible from the biblical text, and both fit the scientific evidence without any problems at all. It's quite possible that both are true. Now you look at it, weigh it up, think about it. But they're possible, they fit all the evidence. Two routes. And if you come to a different conclusion from the person sitting next to you, so be it. Respect each other. What about the fall? The one thing about the fall is consequences. When we try to go our own way, and when we try to reject God's way, there are consequences. The story speaks of shame. It speaks of fear. That's not respect, that's terror. It speaks of a blame culture. It speaks of alienation. And it speaks of a loss of fulfillment. Isn't that a very accurate picture of how much is going on in the world today? Has not the author of the book of Genesis in chapter 3 given us a brilliant picture in a story form of reality? It's true. The fundamental problem is we want to be independent of God, to do it our way, to take our decisions. We want moral autonomy. We decide for ourselves. And that's what happens. How true that is. Isn't that a brilliant picture of just what's happening and has happened in the history of our world, tragically? Original sin. Now, this is a common view. You may share a lot of that, you may have heard it, you may disagree with it. There are things in there that make me uncomfortable. A God of love with eternal conscious torment in hell. A God who views humanity with hostility. Doesn't quite fit the picture I have in my mind of Jesus. I'm going to suggest a better way, because that way developed from the days of Augustine, and it's moved and developed over the centuries, and I think it's got a long way from Genesis and from the Bible in general. Here's another way, and I'm indebted to other people for giving me insights into this. We're all in the same boat. Destructive forces. We compete with each other. And we can't get what we want, there's violence, and we blame each other. And the whole of life is involved. We're all in the same boat. And our personal relationships, personal being, our relationships, and in our societies, communities and nations, it's affected in every way. You see, that's my way of putting it. The fall caused that to happen. And we have distorted the image that was given to us by God. We made a real mess of it. I think that captures what Genesis is saying rather better. What about death? We don't like to talk about death. In a previous presentation, I pointed out that there's perhaps three ways of looking at death. The physical death, the spiritual death, and then the eternal death. And we have to be very careful when we look at the text, because the context tells us very clearly what the author is saying. Be cautious in interpretation, because death doesn't mean every time the physical death that we all have to face. It can mean other things. It's interesting, in the Hebrew, they have no word for hell that's used in the Old Testament. There's a word that speaks of a kind of afterlife, which is a kind of vague, shadowy existence beyond the grave. And it all fits into this picture of how death was seen. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, said God, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Everything in the world is for the benefit of humanity. Everything. I get so concerned when I see religion setting up rules that says you mustn't eat this, you mustn't drink that, you mustn't go there and do that. The world was created for the benefit of humanity. But moral autonomy is closed. We're not in a position to know what's right and wrong. That's God's prerogative. And the Hebrew was die, doubling the word. But what's meant by death in that situation? The death came as a result of the rebellion. Now, science shows that physical death has always existed. It didn't start when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree. The best way to look at it is to look at the reverse. The opposite of death is resurrection. Look at the New Testament. Look at what resurrection meant. Jesus went through physical death and received a restored body, a spiritual body, and a new life. That's the model for us. That was lost when they ate the fruit. That's the death that God is speaking about. Eternity was built in for us. We lost it when we rebelled. And only by God's grace can it be restored. Any continuation of life in any meaningful sense is shut off to us because of the fall. And that makes complete sense. It's faithful to the biblical text and it's consistent with all that science says. How about the origin of evil? Now, these are very difficult questions and I don't have neat answers. The origin of evil in the world. Why do we have to go through the present age? Why did God just not create a perfect heaven and earth? Why did not perfect human beings to populate it? Why does suffering have to exist? Why does God allow evil to continue? Why does God allow Satan so much scope? I have tussled with these questions and in many cases I don't have nice, neat answers. Let me just give you pointers and they may not satisfy you. This is really difficult and there aren't neat answers. We've got to admit that a lot of suffering in the world is self-inflicted. Even things that we blame on disasters are often self-inflicted. Pain is necessary, because without pain, we wouldn't know how to withdraw from things that were dangerous. God gives the universe everything that it needs to bring about his will. All the properties and potentialities for our benefit are there. Life and death are needed in evolution. Evolution is the mechanism God seems to have chosen. It brings about the complexity and the wonder of life. It actually makes life possible, because without evolution, the flexibility wouldn't be there and life would have died out almost from the instant, from the beginning. We are free, but freedom has consequences. We have moral choice, and we have choices to go either God's way or not go God's way. And that's not a one-off, it's throughout all the small and big things of life. Pointers, not neat answers. One of the unique marks of being a human being is we're spiritual, and that gives us choice by definition. We don't just work by instincts, we have choice, the mark of being human. Two great and godly men wrote that God is creating a universe deeply embedded in freedom. They've got it right. There's a verse from Hebrews. I don't understand this fully, but I know from experience it's true. Jesus was the pioneer, the one who went first, the trailblazer of their salvation, that's rescue. Perfect means complete through what he suffered. There is something about suffering love that's so important in the plan of God. This doesn't answer all the questions, but at least it's a pointer. You see, our rebellion has consequences, and that is suffering. And suffering love undoes so much of what's wrong in the world. That's what the writer to the Hebrews is saying. How about chance? I've often heard that said and written. The tragic thing is that the people who say and write that don't understand chance based on the laws of probability. I said laws of probability. They're not broken. They're mathematically founded. What is chance to us is not chance to God. And evolution is not a chance process. If we knew enough, we'd be able to predict its route. So the biologists tell me. There's a logic in the process. It's that logic God used. He chose to use it to bring biological diversity into being, including us. This isn't blind chance. We just don't know enough. Well, is evolution still going on? Yes, it is. Will we end up with some superhuman race that develops from the present human race? Highly unlikely. For three reasons. Now, the first two are more technical. Let's look at the first one. Because, and mainly Christians, the followers of Jesus, we have brought about so many improvements, health, hygiene and medicine, to name but three, and they've come largely from the Christian world, given to the rest of the world. That immediately alters the whole business of natural selection. As a result, we have been reproductively very successful, and we've used our creativity to start to limit family sizes. And that's responsible. We brought about the improvements following the command of Jesus. We've got the creativity so that we don't overpopulate the world and just bring people into the world into lives of poverty and starvation, which is happening in some countries where they don't have contraception. Evolution happens only when there's isolated populations. It's got to get the diversity. With us all moving around and travelling and intermarrying, that isn't happening. We're not going to have a superhuman race coming out, even if we waited for thousands and 10,000s of years. But our world has got a measure of hopelessness. People say this, it's all chance. It's a game. The stars decide it all. God's got it all pre-worked out, nothing we can do to change it. It's all governed by the laws of cause and effect. Let me take these just one by one quickly. It is not chance. We don't understand the meaning of that word. God doesn't work by chance. The idea of God's playing chess with humans is just ridiculous. The idea that stars in space can control events on Earth is just laughable. Fatalism is very much the Islamic view. Inshallah, if God wills. That's not what the Bible teaches, that's not what Jesus said. Cause and effect certainly work, but it isn't quite as simple as that. Let's look at this word freedom a bit further, because it kept coming up with choice. The universe has been created according to certain principles. Genesis says that, the world of science says that. The universe has the freedom to work within these principles. Genesis says that, science says that. We're given moral freedom to take our own decisions. Observation says that, Genesis says that. Things are not predetermined. We have choice. We take decisions, and these decisions can have huge effects. And we can't blame God, inshallah. And the decisions of people in powerful positions can often have huge effects upon millions. There are areas of human existence that are beyond the sciences. The sciences work in a specific way with specific fields of inquiry. But the concept of freedom, human freedom, helps us to make sense of life. We know it's true. We have this measure of freedom. It fits the evidence. God imparted spiritual life to us, and He created us in His image and likeness. That's what Genesis said. Now look at the bit at the bottom. Somewhere and somehow, God came and He gave us freedom. We're no longer animals ruled by instinct. He gave us moral and spiritual freedom, self-consciousness. He gave us creativity, made in His image, and love, made in His image and likeness. This is a new level of being. Look at the world, look at humanity. It fits, it's true. That's what Genesis says. Isn't that a beautiful picture? This is God's wonderful story in creation. Science and Genesis come together consistently to paint it. It's reality, it rings true. God's wonderful story in creation for us all. In our next presentation, we're going to go back to the Genesis story in chapter 4, and I've entitled this Family Tragedy.